Alright everyone, we're hoping of course today for fewer technical problems, although now Gab has some certificate issue at the moment, so can't even share my videos out there. I don't think that this is related to censorship. I think it's more on the technological end, but I guess we'll see it. They're looking into it as of this morning. It's been some hours since it's been reported as a problem. We got to talk about what the UN is now saying with regards to Venezuela. The news, it'd be hard for Venezuela to get more dystopian. 3 million people now have been estimated to have fled recently the nation of Venezuela. There are over 3 million refugees, legit refugees in the case of Venezuela. When you're in a place where there's food scarcity is increasing, you have guerrilla warriors sort of in the fringes of society waiting to assassinate critics of the regime. You have state-sponsored gulags, basically. You have essentially martial law to a limited extent in some urban zones, and you've had essentially the government begin ignoring its own constitution. I would say that under those circumstances you have actual refugee movements. It's not like, hey, like Honduras or something. I don't have a job, there's systemic poverty, therefore I'm a refugee. Well, no, you're an economic migrant. In the case of these people moving from Venezuela, also, you can understand, most of them are preferring to go to Colombia or Brazil. They're moving regionally. They're not trying to come across an entire continent while forming up into 10,000 person mobs or anything like that. They're moving as locally as possible, essentially trying to get a bare bones existence. Now, of course, Colombia and Brazil have their own problems economically speaking, but it's nothing compared to Venezuela, and let's not kid ourselves. The UN doesn't want Venezuela to be doing poorly. The UN, as a heavily globalistic body, does not want to have to admit that a centrally planned, socialized system like Venezuela based on exports failed in such a spectacular manner. Because the UN endorses central planning, commie style, in the most literal sense. That's the element of far leftism that you generally find today in all other economies. In the US, we've got too much central planning. It's not so much socialism in the redistributionist sense. Hell, most of the welfare that we have at all goes to corporations, not to poor people or the working class. We don't give them nearly enough subsidies. We're busy frittering that money away, giving it to arms dealers and cartels and shit through middlemen, or giving it to the CIA and stupid shit like that. But it's the central planning, it's the interventionist aspect that fucks the economy. Unfortunately, in Venezuela's case, it was 1,000 times worse than it is in a normal economy that's somewhat diverse, like the US. It's not like, hey, we sell corn, we sell refined oil. No, there are 1,000 different major exports from the US economy. With Venezuela, 90% of the economy, what is it? It's relatively shitty crude oil. That is, it needs a lot of processing, and the oil prices are too low to make it cost effective for their economy to run on it. What happened is central planning doesn't even kick in with Maduro. We've got to understand most of the people that form the opposition there, they're socialists too. They're socialists who blame Nicolas Maduro for their problems. They say, hey, yeah, Chavez was great, socialism forever, but Nicolas Maduro is corrupt and violent. Ah, yes, he is. So is Hugo Chavez, but Hugo Chavez reigned over Venezuela when oil prices were high, so you never got to see that necessary tin horn side of him that would have otherwise shown. So these people still have statues of Hugo Chavez as though he's not responsible for laying the groundwork for their problem. You didn't have an expansive enough protection for the Constitution there. There was too much central planning. When you have central planning, there is always a reason for any established regime to fritter away what it can redistribute on things that aren't long-term going to help your economy at all. There's a vested interest in doing that to raise approval, to increase stability and to ingratiate itself and get reelected, especially with a democratic socialist system. You have to give people handouts. You have to give them washing machines and microwaves and stuff like that, and subsidize, their heating oil, subsidize their electricity, subsidize education and healthcare and stuff. And so long as oil prices are high, 90% of your economy is crude oil. Oil prices are through the roof. Big ol' USA needs to suck down some more oil heroin, so to speak. Yeah, you can make that. You can make ends meet. Absolutely, there's no problem. The problem is, of course, they were engaging in massive debt spending, and what they were doing, what Hugo Chavez set up and what Maduro continued, is that they were borrowing money essentially on the oil production, with the idea of simply continuously expanding oil production to become the world's greatest fuel muscle. That didn't pan out for them because the oil prices then collapsed by what, 60 or 70%, some insane proportion. Well, they had already borrowed a bunch of money. See, then you have the problem of repaying that debt when you also have interest payments. Now they're paying out half of their economy on just the interest. If you think U.S. debt is crazy, most of which is domestically held or held by our allies anyway, by the way, it's a problem, but it's not quite as big a problem as some people proclaim. It's not like, hey, we're owned by China, like some people think. They're only our second largest foreign creditor, let alone our domestically held debt. But when you're Venezuela, Europe, the European Union, they just forgave a chunk of debt. I think it was some billions of euros that they forgave. China has forgiven part of their debt, but they can't really forgive anymore. I mean, how many billions of dollars are we talking about? China's not foolish. China knows that it can't prop up Venezuela through the oil glut because the oil glut's going to last forever. The oil prices are unlikely to spike back to their former point unless something crazy happens in the Middle East, and I don't think the current regime here has any desire to go dick around over there. Too busy in Korea at the moment. That'll play up with the rare earth mineral prices more than anything else if China gets truly involved in sanctions and those Russian pirates stop smuggling the minerals. It's actually very funny how that's a major aspect of the world's socio-political situation. Geopolitics now hinges on some mountains in Central Asia and North Korea, actually. Believe it or not, because they're mineral rich, and computers happen to need a lot of rare earth minerals. You know, a lot of people don't even understand that. They still think that it's the petrodollar and not the aircraft carrier dollar. That's what it actually is. China's aircraft, what was it? China's aircraft carrier almost sank the moment they put it in the water. Russia's newly minted aircraft carrier, the dry dock it was in, collapsed and a crane fell on it, punched a great big hole in it. So now it's going to take a month to repair it. Yeah, I don't think we have any naval problems in the U.S. By the way, I have my reservations about the long-term tenability of that overall strategy, but it's for right now, it's a good idea, I guess. But yeah, when the UN is calling out your socialist nation with a lot of central planning saying, hey, you get a lot of refugees there, it looks like you're a failed state, and then starts muttering about regime change. The UN loves groups like that. Venezuela is essentially the kind of model they want, only they want to diversify the output more. That's basically what they want, and also the erasing of borders. So like refugee movements, the UN loves it. The UN loves it when they can set up some tent camp in a neighboring state and say, okay, come on in here. We'll give you bare bones rations, and you know we'll have armed guards there, but they won't be given the right to actually defend you if they're attacked. Like it'll be Rwanda style. Have you ever seen what was it, Hotel Rwanda or something like that? The UN forces there, they couldn't even use lethal force in the average scenario unless someone was already throttling them with a machete. Crazy times. Yeah, the UN couldn't take care of the Janjaweed rebels either in Sudan that caused at one point 500,000 people internally displaced in UN refugee camps. And then Sudan had to split, and they still have problems there. It's just a little bit less than before, I suppose. The UN doesn't solve any problems, so when the UN is coming out and saying that socialism has failed us, you know that Venezuela's got some real problems. But the people there have identified the wrong enemy. They've identified it as Nicolas Maduro. He's just a symptom. He's a symptom of central planning and socialist redistributionism. You will always get the kind of corrupt bureaucracy, the corrupt internal and wrongful use of your security forces. You will always get the scrapping of constitutional protections in such a system. Because as soon as things go wrong, all of those become necessary for the entrenched, established political forces to maintain themselves. If you rob them of those powers, if you take away their economic stranglehold, they can't do that anymore, and indeed, there's no real reason to. The risk is higher than the reward. Government should fundamentally be structured in such a way, this is what I believe, that the risk of being corrupt is higher, generally speaking, than the general reward for being corrupt. That is, attempting to maintain your job becomes too risky through any underhanded means, and therefore, generally speaking, you get the smooth transition of government. You get a government that, by and large, is better. Now, of course, we've got our own problems in our government. DC is basically a slime pit. I'm not saying that it's only related to socialist governments. Ours being sort of a mixed model at this point, you know, China in the 1980s, reform period style more than anything else. The truest free market we got in the United States is the internet. They're constantly trying to tax and regulate that. Then they give power to corporations where they can't so that they can censor people, basically for their globalist overlords. That's about all. Peace out.